During the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were involved in the Cold War. Now we know that it had to do with nuclear secrets at American plants, but also the concept of an American conspiracy to end rock and roll was thought to be possible in 1959. Let's take a look at it. By 1959, Elvis Presley was in the Army. Little Richard had become a minister and gave up rock and roll. Jerry Lee Lewis had married his 13-year-old cousin, and his career in rock and roll was destroyed by the media when they found out that actually she wasn't 15 but 13. So Jerry Lee Lewis's career was basically over. Alan Freed was destroyed by the payola scandals, in which disc jockeys were supposedly paid money to play certain records. But probably the biggest effect occurred in 1959 with the death of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. Music changed forever because after 1959 and the death of Buddy Holly, a number of singers like Frankie Avalon, Tommy Sands, and Fabian appeared, which was basically teenage Dean Martin type pop songs. Rock and roll didn't regain its bite until 1964 when the Beatles landed. Now, in American files, we know that while the Bay of Pigs invasion was being considered, that there were un-American activities that Congress was also looking at. And one of those activities had to be with the divisive force of rock and roll. So when you take a look at the government's very well interest in these rock stars, and by 1959, it seems like the fledgling rock and roll industry was dying a hard and quick death, it seems that some people believe that maybe the government had a hand in some of those situations. However, there were other great conspiracies that involved rock and roll in 1967. So, when the Beatles made the landing and rock and roll came back, we had the growth of the counterculture. We had the growth of the hippie movement. We had a group of people who were young who demanded the right to vote. In 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival launched a new love of rock and roll and also the birth of the counterculture. Now, the counterculture was considered to be divisive, and the American FBI was very interested in the whereabouts of a number of rock stars. So let's take a look at Monterey. In Monterey, for the first time, Jimi Hendrix performed. By 1970, Jimi Hendrix would be dead. Janis Joplin also performed and became famous at Monterey. In 1970, she was dead. As a matter of fact, Jimi Hendrix died 2 weeks before Janis Joplin. And when Joplin heard of his death, she said, "Well, I'm glad I didn't die today because he'd get all the publicity." 2 weeks later, she had it all to herself. Otis Redding appeared at Monterey and did probably one of the greatest shows with Booker T and the MGs backing him up with the Memphis Horns. One of the main problems, however, was that Otis Redding was killed in a plane crash just as he was ready to launch his career onward. So, Brian Jones, who had come over to bring Hendrix, the leader of the Rolling Stones, will be dead in 1969 within 2 years. What would the odds be that by 1971, 3 of the major figures of the counterculture would be dead? And of course, that would be Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison. There was, however, one other leader, one who was greater than the other 3 involved, and his name was John Lennon. But that's a different story, and it will end in 1980. This is Gary Patterson. Thanks for walking with me on the dark side. You know, you may think some of these stories are fact and some are fiction, but one thing for certain, you'll never listen to your music exactly the same way again.